Are you ready to make one of the easiest and most versatile blocks in the quilting world? In my opinion, it's the log cabin. Hello everybody, my name is Jenna, and today in 3 Ways To, we are doing 3 different ways to make the log cabin block. And then I'm gonna show you also different quilts that you can make using this one block. We're gonna start with the traditional log cabin because I have a trick and tip to make it a lot easier than other patterns use. Then we are going to do a log cabin that has different variations in sizes of the strips that you're gonna use. And finally, we're gonna do a fun, wonky log cabin block. Let's start with our traditional log cabin block. You need a center square, and you can do whatever size square you want. I tend to do 3 inches or 2.5 inches. I like 3 inches just because it's a little bit bigger and I like a bigger square in the middle. Traditionally, a log cabin block has a red square in the middle, but I think you can do whatever color you want. And so I decided to do brown just because it's a lot darker than the pinks I'm gonna use today. Then you're going to need 2 different variations of color. I like to do it where I have a lighter value and then a darker value. And so for my darker values, I'm doing this pink and then this darker magenta-y pink. Then for the lighter values, I have a light pink and a white or a cream. And for the traditional log cabin block, you just need to be consistent with how thick you cut your strips. I like to do 2.5 inch strips, but you can do 1.5, 2. But today we're starting with a 3 inch center and 2.5 inch strips. One of the ways I like to make a log cabin block easier is the way I sew it together. Traditionally, people will give you specific measurements to cut out each of the pieces and then you sew them together, but I feel like that takes a lot of time. So my favorite way is to just take your whole strip of fabric and we're gonna start sewing our blocks together and cutting the strips down as we sew. To sew this block, I'm going to take my 3 inch square and I'm going to layer one of my strips on top of this, and I am layering my cream strip on top, and I just want to make sure there's a little bit of overlap on both sides. Then I can go ahead and sew my 1/4 inch. Then I am going to go ahead and press this guy out, and now I can go ahead and cut this down. You can use scissors or you can use a rotary cutter, but I'll just cut right on that edge. Now I can go ahead and sew my next block on, and the way I'm making this log cabin is I want my lighter values on one side and my darker values on the other. So because I did a light value first, my next piece is going to be a light value. And when I go to sew all these pieces, I'm doing it in a circular motion. So I did this piece first, I'm going to do this piece next. And because I have this straight edge now, I can line it up perfectly on that edge and sew it using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I can take it over again to press it, and I'm going to press everything out, and then I'll line up one of my lines along that seam and cut a straight edge. I've done my first 2 pieces of my lighter value. Now I'm going to do my next 2 pieces of my darker value. I'm going to grab this pink and I'm going to put this pink right on this side. Then I can go ahead and cut those straight lines. Now from here, it's easier to see where I need to place my next strip. So where these 3 pieces are on the edge, I'm just gonna line that up and sew it again using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll cut off that edge, and then now because I'm going to this side, I can see that these are my lighter values, so I'm going to want to place a lighter value fabric on this side. And again, because I have those 3 pieces that meet up, I know that my next fabric is going to go right here. And then I'll just keep repeating this process until that whole block is done. And if you're wondering, how do I know this whole block is done? It is done whenever you want it to be done. For this particular block, I just wanted to do 2 stripes. So 2 sections with the lighter value and then 2 stripes with the darker value. But you can do whatever you want depending on how big you want your block to be. One of the things I love about the log cabin block is the variations of quilts you can make just using one single block. So I mocked up some quilts for you, just so you can see. This first variation of a log cabin block is, you can see we got a lighter values, we got the darker, and you just kind of put them all the same direction. And that one is fun, cool, but if you want to, you can get even more funky with it. You can put the darker values towards the middle to create these diamond shape. You can create some stripes with your darker and lighter values. You can reverse the darker and lighter values again with the diamond, so you have your lighter ones inside. You can make it where it looks like your diamond is expanding throughout the quilt. And all of these quilt variations use 16 log cabin blocks. And then for these blocks, I made sure that there was 4 stripes of each value. Here's another way you could just switch the orientation of your blocks, and that's super cute. And then we got some zigzag. And so all of these different variations you can make using this one block and just make 16 of them, which isn't that hard. Our second variation of the log cabin block is going to be using different sized strips. And there are 2 different ways you can do this. You can do it like this, where I used smaller strips for the lighter values and then thicker strips for the darker values. Or you can switch it up where this square is all the same size strip, and then you can do a bigger strip here and then a smaller strip for the next square and kind of build that out a little bit differently, but it's just whatever way you want to do it. For this variation, I cut a bunch of 1.5-inch strips for my lighter value, and I used the 2.5-inch strips for my darker value, and I sewed it the exact same way I did originally. So I started with my lighter value strips, and I placed them on one side, and then I did my darker value in the thicker on the other side. Then you're just going to repeat that same process that we did with the traditional block of turning your block to sew on that next strip every single time until you have all of your blocks sewn. For this block, I decided to do 3 smaller strips and then 3 larger strips in the darker value. When making the mock-up quilts for this particular block, I decided to do 2 versions of them. One doing the size variations like this, where it's consistently the smaller on either the lighter or darker value and then the bigger on the other side. Then I also decided to do one where this square part is the same size, so it starts with maybe a smaller square, thinner, and then it goes to a thicker square and then a thinner square and so forth. So for this particular design, you can see that we have small, big, small, big, small, small. So the size variation is a little bit different, and you can see how that makes the quilts just look a little different. I love the diamond version of this, and you can see how different fabrics pop based off their thickness, and I think that is super cute. The reverse of it is super fun. Then with this next variation, it's using this block right here, and you can see how instead of a diamond, it makes a circle shape, which I think is super fun and unique. And if we flip it, then the diamonds are the lighter shades, and it's just so beautiful. And again, this is just using 16 log cabin blocks, all made the same way. Then again, doing this zigzaggy shape, it's just a little bit more wavy and it curves better. And so this one is super fun to use depending on the way you want your finished block to look. Our third variation of the log cabin quilt is the Wonky log cabin quilt block. And this one I think is the most fun, and you don't have to be super precise with this one, which is what I love. To make the Wonky log cabin block, you're going to start with your middle square like normal, and then you're going to add your 2 light variations and your 2 darker variations, and then you're going to stop. And now, instead of adding on the next piece like normal, we're gonna get a little bit wonky with it. And you can do it whatever way you want, but the way I like to do it is I like to just have one side at the corner and then the other side maybe 1 inch or 1.5 inches down, just like that. The more angled your piece is, the more wonky it's going to be. So I'm just gonna start there. Then I'm gonna sew this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And with the Wonky block, before you go to press it, you want to cut off that extra fabric. So I'll just line my 1/4 inch line on my seam, and I can go ahead and press it. And remember, when you press your log cabin block, it is easier just to press all of those seams away from that center block, but you can really press it whatever way you want. Now I can go ahead and just cut these parts straight, and I'm just lining up the edge of my ruler on that edge right here. And now I can add my next piece, and I am going to do it wonky again by just angling this guy down a little bit, and I can sew it using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then because I've done my 2 lighter values, I'm moving on to my darker value side so I can get this nice little magenta-y color. And I'll do that same thing. I'll angle it down. And with this Wonky quilt block, you can really do whatever you want with it. For this guy, I made sure that there were 3 lighter value and 3 darker value pieces. Or you can switch it up by doing 3 lighter value or 3 darker value and then 2 of the other, or so forth. And then that middle center piece is gonna be a little bit off. Then when you go down to trim this Wonky quilt block, I like it when all of the log cabin parts look wonky, and then the center square looks like it's perfect straight on. There's no tilt to it at all. And so I'll use that center square to kind of guide where I'm going to cut. And so I like to line up one of the lines on my ruler with the edge of my square just to make sure everything's good. And then I can go ahead and cut this block. So I'll square off one side. And for this guy, I'm going to do an 11-inch block. And then I'll square off the other side. And look how fun and wonky that is. Here are the 2 side by side, and when you put them together, there are so many fun variations of this quilt that are out there. Here are some quilt mock-ups I made specifically with this particular block. First, we got our stripe version, which I think it being wonky just makes it a little bit more fun and funky. And you can see all of the center squares are straight on. And so it's the stripes that are kind of adding a little bit of character to it. We've got the diamonds, which are super pretty and cool. I love this version, which is just you're putting the blocks straight on like normal, just putting them right next to each other, not switching up the orientation of them at all. And then this version changes the orientation of the wonky block, and I think it just is so beautiful. And now you know how to do a traditional log cabin quilt block. You know how to change up the sizes of your strips to make a more unique look. And now you know how to do a wonky log cabin quilt block. And I'm curious, in the comments, please let me know what your opinion is about log cabin quilt blocks. I tend to love them, but you may not like them. And if you don't like them, why don't you like them? Do you like all of these variations? Do you have a favorite? I think my favorite's the wonky quilt block. And if you're interested, I wrote a pattern for the traditional log cabin quilt block, and I put 6 different variations of quilts that you can make with that traditional block. It is for free in the description below. Go ahead and download it. And thank you so much for joining me here on 3 Ways To, and I'll see you next time.